Hello everyone, and greetings from the land of the Coast Salish and Duwamish people, known as Seattle, Washington in the United States. I'm Brandy, and for the last decade of my life, I have sought to hold the tension between fighting institutional oppression and violence both in the US and in the church more broadly. And really just being a human person who exists in the world that we live in, which is increasingly complicated. And if you're anything like me, you might live in a carousel of emotions that rotate between exhausted and overwhelmed, joyful, confused, resigned, determined, and hopeful. It's a mixed bag and one that makes the question, how are you, deeply loaded. But as we spend time together today, I want to pause and consider, even just for a moment as we get going together, how you are. What is on your mind right now? What triumphs and disappointments are you carrying in? What in your life needs attention? What needs are not being met? Take some breaths as you're able throughout our time together. And as you breathe, I want you to pay attention to your body, where you're experiencing tension or pain, or even just feeling off. Try to soften as you are able. Give yourself a brief self-massage, or do a bit of stretching as we go along in our time. The invitation today is to show up as you are, not necessarily as you wish you were. I think about the story of Jesus in Mark 4, where after a chaotic chunk of ministry days, Jesus gets into his disciples' boat just as he was, and seemingly immediately goes to sleep. Apparently he was tired. And while this story gets chaotic fast with a storm making the disciples, some of whom were fishermen, let fear get beyond who they know they are and what they know how to do, it's also a story of Jesus modeling something important. He gets into a boat with people who are in an unknown and sort of chaotic mission and world together, and Jesus shows up just as he is, tired, needing a break from ministry, and in a newly developing community of people trying to figure out what it means to be together. So as we spend time together, even virtually, I want us to hold each other with tenderness, to be okay with being just as we are, as we engage, or maybe you just need to disengage today, and to recognize that the relentlessness of the world that we live in isn't something for us to consistently triumph over, but rather an opportunity to discover who we are in the midst of all of it, what we're about, what we will fight for, and how we will be in our ministries, families, and in the world. In our couple of times together today, I want us to consider the legacy that we inherit from women that came before us in the scriptures. I want to look at women in the text who were not supernatural or magical in any way, but rather responded to what was in front of them out of who they were, and it was good enough. Their character and attentiveness to their community allowed them, in the right moments, to act when it counted, not necessarily to act in every single moment like many of us feel the pressure to do. These women, Shifrah, Puah, and Rahab that we'll talk about today, are examples of what it looks like to do the long haul work of connecting to our communities, developing character within ourselves, and being deeply aware of and engaged in the political and social realities that will require our attention, especially as ministers and clergy people. Our reflections on these women are not meant to add pressure to our lives to become great heroes of other people, but rather to set ourselves up to fight and minister for who we love and what we love when it matters, no matter how big or small. And in that, to leave a legacy for those after us, to be able to pick up the mantle of faithfulness and love and justice and attentiveness. In that way, we're actually not trying to be good ministers or clergy people. We're trying to set ourselves up to be good ancestors. So as we enter the scriptures and start together, we're going to start with an interconnected group of women in Exodus. I love Exodus. It's a book about the liberation of an ethnic group of people from the hands and violence of their oppressors. It is a story about a group of people being pulled from a toxic imperial reality and invited to dream of a new type of world and community as God intended it. A reality where all can be free, not just from enslavement, but to fully live as themselves. It is a model of what it means to be a just and good follower of God. In the beginning of the story, it says that the Hebrew people had become too numerous and their collective potential for power creation threatened the empire. Pharaoh, essentially the king of Egypt, responds to this by enslaving them in the name of national security. Exodus 1:13-20 tells us, "The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of them whom was named Shifrah and the other Puah, quote, When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives come to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became strong. So Pharaoh tells the Hebrew midwives to kill any male children that they are helping to birth. Not only does Pharaoh create a system of forced subjugation in enslaving the people, but he tries to use the healthcare sphere to guarantee the Hebrews are dehumanized. Systemic oppression nearly always works this way, with one system of oppression building on many others. Can you imagine the fear and grief that Hebrew mothers felt as they went through their pregnancies and prepared to give birth, knowing that their sons were mandated to die? I am not a mother, and I cannot imagine that pain, but as I see the mothers of slain Black men and trans women at the hands of police and white supremacists in the United States, I get a glimpse of the horrors that this text points us to and toward. As I observe the rollback of reproductive access and rights in the US, it is not lost on me that men in power often resort to controlling the bodies of non-men in order to ensure a certain degree of established and maintained political power. It is truly exhausting. What is interesting about this story in Exodus is that our earliest hero actually is not Moses or some other man in any way, nor is it even God's self, but it is a group of courageous women. They are some of the first and most effective activists and advocates and ancestors in the text. And it's not lost on me that the patriarchal lenses that we use to read the text prevent us from seeing these women as core parts of the story. The story tells us that the Hebrew midwives, Shifrah and Puah, feared God and refused to participate in the system that was killing their boys. I love that in this narrative that they get names. Not even the most powerful person in Egypt gets a name in this narrative, but they do. Shifrah and Puah refuse to kill the children, and this reaches Pharaoh's ear. He calls them in, and they make up and rely on him believing in ethnic stereotypes saying that Hebrew women just give birth too fast and they can't get there fast enough to stop it. I kind of think this is an awesome strategy and one that I wish I would come up for myself in my own activism. But either way, because of their work, they have the ear of the Pharaoh and use their vocation to create a barrier between the powerful and the vulnerable. They are the brave community members who show up and do their part, and for the most part, they get no credit from history compared to Moses, who, right, only lived and was a liberator because of the women that honored his life and came before him. We really do give men a lot of credit in these texts. In this way, though, these women model that becoming a good ancestor isn't about credit. It's about faithfulness to do what is right in the midst of a world of death and violence toward the marginalized, and really toward all of us. These women are good elders and people, and they're folks who see the plight of their own people and do something about it. They use the revolutionary work of bringing life into the world as a way of saving part of a generation of Hebrew boys. They risk their jobs, their lives, and their status to make sure that people like them and after them had a chance to live. And I want to be conscious of noting that these are regular women who aren't platformed or necessarily influential in any way. Sometimes interpreting these stories might lead us to believe that these moments of showing up mean that our lives should be a constant string of high-risk, high-intensity work to partner with God to redeem the world. It's always more, and it's too much pressure. Instead, these stories are about women who act at the right place and the right time when it matters. And it's born out of their love of their community, their knowing what's going on around them, and their fear of God. But Pharaoh is not about to be bested by these women who give birth too fast, so he escalates. He commands that the Hebrew babies now be thrown into the Nile River. Like in our own culture, violence always finds new and creative and problematic ways to oppress and take the lives of those that they see as disposable. So that is the moment that we meet 3 more courageous women and good ancestors who lead the way for God's people to become free. Moses' mother, who is unnamed in the text, refuses to do violence to her own child and hides newborn Moses with her for 3 months. I imagine that the fear that she lived with every day was relentless as she kept watch of him, hoping that he wouldn't be seen or heard, taken away from her, or killed by the authorities. It's brutal and inhumane. And at the point that it was too dangerous to hide him any longer, she crafts a basket to be able to float in the river. So she indeed throws her child into the Nile, but not in the way that Pharaoh intended. Moses' mother and sister go down to the river and send him away, hoping that he might live and that life somewhere else would provide a chance of safety. His sister stands by the shore and watches her baby brother float away. She stays in the pain of the moment and watches from a distance to see what might happen. She doesn't avert her eyes. She acts and she watches. And then she gets the chance to act again. I think this is core to becoming a good elder and a good ancestor. That we let the character and compassion of God and our love and belief in the dignity of other people sink in so deeply that we live cycles of action and reflection, seeing and responding, hearing and doing in such a way that both we and the world, even our little worlds around us, see some form of life and freedom and liberation. Providentially, at this moment, Pharaoh's daughter goes down to bathe in the Nile River at this very moment. She sees the basket with Moses in the water and has compassion on him when she hears him cry. Right? It's a reflection of his humanity. And I want to name that this is a fundamentally low bar, but it is fascinating that in this story that Moses, when he is seen as a vulnerable baby, even though they know he is a Hebrew, that his life is worth saving. Pharaoh's daughter finds that the issue is no longer a far-out issue of those people out there, but of a baby that is right in front of her. It's not a distant issue. And this tells me that proximity matters in how we see, honor, and believe people who aren't like us, or even believe ourselves and learn to listen to our own bodies, because I know many of us were taught not to do that. Proximity and attentiveness helps us to believe that people's bodies and stories, our own bodies and stories, matter. When we're close to suffering or pain, it can compel us to act, and we see that here, and I hope that we can give that to ourselves. Because when we seek to do the work of ministry and justice without proximity, we often fall into paternalistic patterns, imposing what we think others need on them. And often we can feel gratified in our attempts to do good deeds, or that we try just enough to make ourselves better, when it's not the point. Moses' sister then offers to find a woman to nurse the child and reunites Moses with his mother. I imagine that she thought she would probably never see her child again and feared the worst, but the compassion of Pharaoh's daughter and shrewd courage of Miriam to approach a powerful stranger make it so that he not only lives, but that his mother gets to see him and participate in his life in an intimate way. Justice for Moses and life for Moses come because a group of women subverted the power structures of the day to save him. One of the things I love about these stories is that these women, in their bar for justice and compassion and life, they set it so high, and they are compelled to risk their own lives and well-being to save an entire generation of their people. And it is only because of them that Moses can partner with God to save them from oppression and enslavement later. It is an intergenerational partnership to rescue and save the people. They have a creativity that's brought forth because they fear God and love their people, even children who are not their own. And they only have to play their part. These women, in playing their part, set the tone for Moses' life. They see the need to be good elders and ancestors, people who sustain the lives of those coming after them, and we so often forget them in the story. Moses isn't an independent hero. He's a person who comes from a legacy of powerful women whose footsteps he follows, and it makes me think about gratitude in the ways that many of you just need to hear people know that people say thank you, that they see what you do and that they care. Because I'm trying to care more as I watch activists in the streets literally risking their lives in the US to fight gun violence. I see the stories of the women in Exodus in them. I'm watching Black queer women lead the charge for Black Lives Mattering, and we're seeing rumblings of systemic change around the country. They are seeing the death of their siblings and saying no with their bodies and with their time and with their money. When I see people celebrating pride and being themselves out loud, I see the legacy of people like Marsha P. Johnson and many others who fought and loved so that the others could simply be. They are so like Shifrah and Puah. And I see a chance for those of us who consider ourselves or want to be accomplices in this story. We may not be the center, but we want to be involved. Pharaoh's daughter sees the impact of an injustice started by her people when it comes to her. She doesn't abdicate responsibility to someone else or make excuses about just because her dad was oppressive doesn't mean that she is, nor does it make it about her feelings about it. She instead takes more responsibility than is asked of her and joins her story to the story of the marginalized and the hurting. And this all happens before a single mention of God's movement in the story. It seems like God takes the baton from these courageous women to save the people. It isn't until nearly a chapter later that we see God show up or act at all. And what this tells me is that what we know about God allows us to have deep creativity and courage that then God uses to work out a legacy of love and freedom and joy in us first and through us. It also tells me that the works of God may not look explicit, flashy, or what we would expect. The problem for many of us is that we've been taught to see ourselves in the shoes of the heroes in the story, and the pressure is too high. To see ourselves as Moses, the one who should liberate all people, when what we are given in the text at this earliest point is a group of regular people moved with compassion who become good elders and legacy builders even when there's no credit to be had. This isn't moving toward being cynical people who can critique all the issues or ourselves, but into people that can and will leave a legacy for those after us. Because moving toward being a good ancestor isn't about having the right ideas. It's about bringing ideas into reality with our lives, in our communities, in the small ways that we love, and in our partnership with God, who is always looking for those who would say yes to partnering for the renewal of all things big and small. I wonder what would happen if we left a legacy where everyone, regardless of their gender identity, knew that they could have a clear path to church leadership, where there's no need to deconstruct our faith because we've created healthy faith communities that reliably love those that come after us. What if we left a legacy where reparations for wrongs done were normal because God, throughout the scriptures, honors and blesses those who restore what they and their people destroy? What if that happened in the church? What if the later generations that come after us never had to choose between their faith community and their gender or sexual identity because we destroyed homophobia in our midst? What if we let these times that we're in, these horribly chaotic and painful times, shape us into good ancestors in the spirit of the women of Exodus? What we're really talking about right now requires integrity over the long haul. It's about trying to become people who are formed rather than simply being performative, which I find to be much more comforting. I think about Paulo Freire a lot, and he defines praxis, or this outer working of our theology, and calls people to transformation through a pattern of action and reflection. Really, it's basic discipleship. We start somewhere in the cycle and let reflection or learning change how we act, and then act and let our action lead us to deeper reflection that leads us to becoming renewed people. In Christianity, I think we would call this the process of constant conversion. That we hear the word of Jesus, and then we practice the way, and then we find it to be true and bringing life in our own lives and around us. Being a good ancestor looks more like consistency and diligence in our own action and reflection than it does about being people who settle for a low bar of just knowing more theology or knowing more dogma. But I think this is hard because many of us grew up in contexts where indoctrination mattered much more than imagination. And our Christianity has created a low bar where doing the bare minimum of what people outside of our walls are doing is what we settle for. In Luke 6, Jesus gives a warning against this kind of idea. He tells people to love their enemies, and then he says this: "If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High." Essentially, what Jesus is saying here is that followers of Jesus should not expect to get credit for doing basic things, even if those things are good and healthy for us. Even sinners do that. He's saying if you love people like you, that's basic. If you lend things but expect something in return, it's too low of a bar. Jesus then ups the ante of love and sets the standard of what it means to be followers of Jesus. Love your enemies, do good, lend, and expect nothing in return. But this teaching of Jesus isn't just about credit, it's really about motives. In our culture, I think this teaching could sound something like, if you say Black Lives Matter, what credit is that to you? Even Amazon does that. If you speak out about injustice, what is that to you? Even sinners repost on Instagram. If you give your money to justice organizations or reject toxic embedded Christian ideologies, so what? You are no better than sinners. I believe that we have to set a high bar for Christian witness and activism in a world where the bar is too low and too lacking in creativity. It is one that relies on co-opting the best of what's happening outside of us and then feeling good about ourselves for doing the right thing. I think Jesus would say, even sinners do that. Your creativity is what the world needs. What you have and who you are just as you are is good and what we need. Because scripture tells us to not grow weary in doing good, no small feat there. And that's not something that we can just will ourselves to do alone, but something that we have to partner with God and our colleagues and friends to do together. Because when it comes down to it, becoming a good ancestor is hard won. Because it's easier to have the optics of a good and just and righteous and happy life than it actually is to really live any of those things. And frankly, most of us are too tired and discouraged to do all of the work that we think might be required to be good enough. The invitation is to be just as we are. And what I love about the story in Exodus is that the women are not expected to make the impossible happen by becoming superheroes. They are doing their work day to day in their normal lives and jobs and families and become people who save a generation in that normalcy. It's everyday work, not magical work. And that means that you get to be fully human if they got to. You get to burn out and break down and to get to not want to show up to ministry. You get to be fed up with these people and be fed up with each other, really. You get to have bad days and need a nap and be hungry and make mistakes and feel disengaged. And it means that God, knowing that and experiencing that, wants to be proximate to you therein, just as you are. And I wonder if that is what many of us need today. To know that whatever messiness we're in, whatever we are feeling, whatever failures and successes that we are bringing in, that they're all a part of our story, and our only job is to keep on being ourselves in all of it and being ourselves together, just as we are.